Watch the 10 bloodiest rulers in history. Join me as I delve into the dark past and challenge myself to uncover the most bloodthirsty rulers in history, those who shocked the world. Have you ever wondered about the most ruthless rulers in history? Those who spread terror, committed horrific massacres, and plunged their people into unbearable suffering? In this video, we will explore a list of the 10 most brutal and bloodthirsty rulers, focusing on their actions and their impact on the world. Some led genocidal campaigns, while others spread terror through oppressive methods. Are you ready for this journey through the darkest chapters of history? Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945. When Hitler took power in Germany in 1933, he began implementing a systematic plan to eliminate any group that did not fit his racial vision of what he called the pure Aryan race. He issued the Nuremberg Laws, which turned Jews into second-class citizens, isolating them completely in ghettos before deporting them to Nazi concentration camps. His goal was not just persecution, but total extermination, in what became known as the Holocaust. Over 6 million Jews were murdered in horrifying ways, including mass executions using toxic gas, starvation, and deadly medical experiments. Hitler did not limit his oppression to within Germany, but unleashed the Nazi war machine. His forces invaded Poland in 1939, followed by France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, and many others. The scorched earth policy meant that any city occupied by his forces had to be completely destroyed if they were forced to retreat. In the Soviet Union, Nazi forces committed horrific massacres, such as the Babi Yar massacre in Kiev, where over 33,000 Jews were executed in just 2 days. In the Battle of Stalingrad, Hitler issued strict orders forbidding retreat, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and millions of Soviet civilians who were deliberately targeted with starvation and destruction. Even when the Third Reich was collapsing, he refused to admit defeat and ordered the destruction of Germany's infrastructure so that the enemy could not benefit from it, known as the Nero Decree. Hitler also had an obsession with art and artifacts, looting European museums and ordering the burning of artworks that did not align with his racist ideology. In the end, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in 1945, leaving behind massive destruction and the deadliest war in modern history, which claimed more than 70 million lives worldwide. Genghis Khan, 1162 to 1227. Genghis Khan was a storm that swept across the world in the 13th century, turning entire cities into ruins and fertile lands into desolate wastelands. He started as the leader of a small Mongol tribe, but soon united the clans under his rule, launching an unprecedented wave of conquest and destruction. Genghis Khan was known for his absolute brutality, believing that any enemy who resisted should be completely exterminated. In the Iranian city of Nishapur, after one of his generals was killed, he ordered his soldiers to kill the entire population, including children and infants, then stack their severed heads into massive pyramids. In Bokhara, he gathered the people in the main square and told them, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you," before slaughtering them all. The Mongols used terrifying psychological tactics, releasing prisoners with severed limbs to spread fear in other cities, often leading to their surrender without a fight. They also used corpses as biological weapons, catapulting plague-infected bodies over the walls of besieged cities. During his invasion of Persia and Iraq, Genghis Khan exterminated hundreds of thousands of people and destroyed irrigation systems, causing desertification in large parts of these regions. In China, during a battle against the Jin dynasty, he ordered the killing of more than 10 million people in northern China alone, with some areas not recovering demographically for centuries. By the time of his death in 1227, Genghis Khan had conquered nearly half of the known world, killing over 40 million people. Even after his death, his sons and grandsons continued his blood-soaked legacy, making the Mongol Empire one of the deadliest in history. Joseph Stalin, 1878 to 1953. Joseph Stalin was one of the most brutal rulers in modern history, governing the Soviet Union with an iron fist and using repression and mass killings to maintain absolute control. After Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin eliminated all his political rivals through brutal methods, including assassinations, show trials, and exile to forced labor camps in Siberia, where millions perished from starvation, disease, and mistreatment. One of his most deadly crimes was the Great Famine, Holodomor, that struck Ukraine in the early 1930s. Stalin enforced the forced confiscation of agricultural crops to accelerate industrialization, leading to the deaths of between 3 to 7 million people from starvation. Peasants were executed for merely attempting to keep a portion of their harvest, while Soviet forces surrounded villages and prevented food from reaching the population. During the Great Purge, 1936 to 1938, Stalin carried out a political extermination campaign targeting senior military leaders, intellectuals, scientists, and even doctors. People were arrested on fabricated charges, forced to confess to crimes they had not committed, and then either executed or sent to the infamous Gulag labor camps, where millions perished due to starvation, torture, and extreme cold. His brutality was not limited to the Soviet Union, but extended to Eastern European countries after World War II. Stalin imposed repressive communist regimes in Poland, East Germany, Romania, Hungary, and others, using mass repression and assassinations to ensure no opposition to his rule emerged. Stalin was obsessed with paranoia, to the extent that he ordered the elimination of his closest allies and even the doctors treating him, believing they were conspiring against him. He was also known for his cruelty toward his family, as it was alleged that he drove his second wife to suicide and showed no sympathy for his children. Stalin's bloody legacy remains a subject of debate, with some viewing him as a strong leader who contributed to making the Soviet Union a global power, while others see him as a tyrant responsible for the deaths of over 20 million people through executions, famines, and mass arrests. Pol Pot, 1925 to 1998. Imagine waking up one day to find your entire city emptied of its inhabitants, with everyone forced to march for days into the countryside to live as slaves in the fields. This is what Pol Pot did when he seized power in Cambodia in 1975. Obsessed with the idea of creating a pure agrarian society, he viewed anyone living in cities or possessing an education as a threat to his revolution. Within a few years, Cambodia turned into a massive mass grave where anyone suspected of being an enemy of the state was executed, even if they were merely a doctor, a teacher, or someone wearing glasses, since glasses were considered a sign of intellectualism, which his regime rejected. The killing fields were filled with the skulls of victims who were brutally murdered, often beaten to death with hammers or stabbed with knives because the regime refused to waste bullets on them. More than 2 million people perished under his rule, turning the country into a living hell. Vlad the Impaler, 1431 to 1476. Many have heard of Dracula, but the true story behind this character is more terrifying than any myth. Vlad III, known as the Impaler, was a Romanian prince infamous for his brutal methods of torturing his enemies, most notably impalement, where long stakes were slowly driven through victims' bodies, leaving them to suffer for hours or even days before dying. He took pleasure in watching executions and was said to have dined amid a forest of rotting corpses. On one occasion, he executed 20,000 people in a single day outside the city of Targovist, leaving their bodies impaled as a warning to any enemies who dared challenge him. Even when he was captured, he managed to deceive his captors by portraying himself as a ruthless and powerful leader. Despite his terrifying reputation, some in Romania still regard him as a hero for defending his land against the Ottomans, though his bloody history remains one of the most horrifying in history. Saddam Hussein, 1937 to 2006. When Saddam Hussein took power, he turned Iraq into one of the most repressive countries in the world. Tolerance had no place in his rule, and any opposition was met with brutal suppression. One of his most infamous crimes was the chemical attack on the city of Halabja in 1988, where more than 5,000 people, many of them women and children, died within minutes, suffocating as toxic gases filled the streets. His intelligence services used unprecedented methods of torture, including dissolving dissidents in acid, subjecting them to a slow and agonizing death. During his rule, his forces carried out ethnic cleansing campaigns against the Kurds, killing tens of thousands. Even after his fall and capture, he refused to acknowledge his crimes, and when he was executed, the world watched as he faced his fate with the same coldness with which he had ruled Iraq for decades. Francisco Franco, 1892 to 1975. Franco was not just a dictator, he was the architect of decades of terror in Spain. After leading the nationalists to victory in the Spanish Civil War, he launched a systematic purge, executing tens of thousands in show trials, or without any trial at all. Prisons overflowed with dissidents, and detention centers became places of slow death. He had a secret police force that monitored everything, and anyone suspected of loyalty to the former Republican government simply disappeared. Even children were not spared. Many were kidnapped from their families to be re-educated in institutions loyal to his regime. When he died, his death was not just the end of a dictator, but the conclusion of an entire era of repression that had instilled fear in millions of Spaniards. Mao Zedong, 1893 to 1976. Mao was not just a revolutionary leader, he was responsible for one of the greatest disasters in human history. During his Great Leap Forward campaign, he attempted to transform China into a major economic power, but instead, he caused a famine that devastated the country, leading to the deaths of more than 45 million people. The famine was not a natural disaster but the result of his oppressive policies, which forced peasants into failing agricultural projects and prevented them from keeping food. In some villages, starvation was so severe that people resorted to cannibalism. Even when his policies failed, he did not relent. Instead, he launched the Cultural Revolution, turning China into a nightmare where intellectuals and scholars were executed and millions were sent to labor camps where they died under torture. Tamerlane, 1336 to 1405. If Genghis Khan represented ultimate terror in the 13th century, then Tamerlane, Timur, was his successor in the 14th century, with an added level of sadism and brutality. Born in what is now Uzbekistan, he claimed to be a descendant of Genghis Khan and sought to revive the Mongol Empire, but with unprecedented cruelty. Tamerlane was infamous for his horrific punishments against cities that resisted him. In Baghdad, he ordered the beheading of more than 100,000 people, stacking their heads into massive towers, a practice he repeated in every conquered city. In Samarkand, he slaughtered almost all its inhabitants, sparing only skilled artisans to serve him while killing or enslaving the rest. In Delhi, India, he committed one of history's worst massacres, executing over 200,000 captives and ordering his soldiers to kill the local population indiscriminately, to the point that the streets were flooded with blood. In a battle against the Ottomans, he captured Sultan Bayezid I and kept him in an iron cage, dragging him around as a form of humiliation. Tamerlane took pleasure in extreme torture, including boiling victims alive, burying them alive, or dragging them to death. He also used psychological warfare by leaving piles of corpses along the roads to instill fear in his enemies. Despite his savagery, he saw himself as a patron of culture and the arts, building schools and mosques while destroying anything that displeased him. After his death in 1405, his empire quickly collapsed, but the devastation and terror he left behind remain a lasting part of history. Leopold II of Belgium, 1835 to 1909. When discussing the worst colonial crimes in history, Leopold II stands out as one of the most ruthless rulers ever. Unlike other monarchs, he personally owned the Congo Free State, treating it as his private enterprise. He exploited its people brutally to extract rubber and ivory. Workers who failed to meet their quotas faced horrific punishments, having their hands cut off or seeing their entire families slaughtered. Reports describe entire villages being burned while children were whipped or killed in front of their parents. It is estimated that up to 10 million people died under his rule, a number exceeding the casualties of some world wars. Yet, for years, Leopold deceived the international community by claiming his rule was aimed at civilizing the region. His atrocities were finally exposed by journalists and surviving witnesses. These are just a few of history's bloodiest rulers, but the past is filled with more terrifying figures. Who else do you think should be added to this list? Are there modern leaders comparable to these historical figures? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating historical content.